I try not to get triggered. I get triggered not over silly things, but over serious things. And I am full-blown triggered over this today. So we have talked a lot on the show about this fight in communities like Tenino and Enumclaw, Washington, to push back against what's called SVP, sexually violent predators, from being placed in less restrictive facilities in their communities. So Washington is an interesting state when it comes to sex offenders. So you've got your, I guess for lack of a better phrase, I'll call it a run-of-the-mill sex offender who, gets convicted, serves their time, gets released into the community, and then you can look them up on some database online and see, hey, are there any sex offenders in my neighborhood? Then there are the worst of the worst of the worst. And they're called sexually violent predators, and they're so bad that the state deems them irredeemable, and they're placed on an island away from the rest of us. There's a reason for that. It's because of all the sex offenders out there who are all bad, they are the worst and the most incapable, according to a court of law, in not reoffending. People out at McNeil Island, with the other SVPs, these are people who in a lot of instances have repeatedly victimized, sometimes young kids. These are bad people, okay? But under the law, we have something called the Constitution, and I love the Constitution. You can't just throw an American, even a horrible, awful American, on an island and forget about them. So in order for it to be constitutional to do that with these sexual deviants, you have to give them a path to be able to get off the island. And so essentially what's happening is there can be a petition, maybe it's from the offender themselves, and they petition to say, hey, I'm rehabilitated, I want to get off this island, and if a court grants it, then they can be moved into these less secure facilities in neighborhoods across the state, in communities across the state. And there's something called this equal share clause, which means if you've got X amount of sex offenders from this county on McNeil Island, then you have to have a facility in that county to house them if they get off McNeil Island. So you've had this massive push when communities were blindsided by these placements. One of them happened in Enumclaw, where you've got a guy who on multiple occasions sexually assaulted or abused young women. He gets placed, unbeknownst to the community, at a less secure facility, just a few yards from a bus stop. And they're like, what the hell? And they fought and fought and fought, but this guy's still there. And then Tenino succeeded in stopping the placement of SVPs in a house out on the outskirts of Tenino. So as all of this was boiling over during the legislative session, there was a budget proviso that was added to the state budget that was signed by the governor that would have required something very common sense, and it had bipartisan agreement, that the state has to do more to notify communities when one of these perverts is going to move in next door. There's nothing controversial about that. These are the worst of the worst of the worst sex offenders. They were so bad they had to be put on an island. Yeah, if the state's going to let them come off the island into your backyard, yeah, the state should probably take just a modest amount of effort to notify you about it, to make sure that you can protect your kids, that you know who this guy is. Governor Jay Inslee, I kid you not, just yesterday, vetoed that budget proviso requiring that DSHS do more to notify communities of these placements. And the reason, his rationale for vetoing it, if it could make it worse, it actually makes it worse. The governor wrote that the provisos in question are, quote, administratively burdensome to the Department of Social and Health Services. Administratively burdensome. First of all, since when are you, a Democrat, worried about government being administratively burdensome? That's what you've built, is an administratively burdensome government. But of all the things, of all the red tape government bureaucracy that you're willing to accept, you are not willing to accept the burden of having to notify communities that the worst of the worst sex offenders are going to be put in their backyard. That to the governor is administratively burdensome. How incredibly offensive, how gross. That's why I titled this episode A Middle Finger to Parents, to these parents that have been fighting tooth and nail for just a little bit of heads up. God forbid the state that works for us gives us a heads up if there's someone being placed in our community that has repeatedly sexually abused children. God forbid that's a little bit administratively burdensome. I will say I loved two Republican lawmakers, including the House Minority Leader, put out a statement on this, and they represent the Enumclaw area, and so they've obviously had experience with this particular issue. And they wrote in a joint statement, this stubborn approach to governing is exactly why so many of our constituents on the Enumclaw Plateau were thrilled to hear this would be Governor Inslee's final term. And I absolutely echo those sentiments. So when I heard this news, one of the first people I reached out to is a woman named Sarah Fox. We've had Sarah Fox on the show, and she is one of several parents in Tenino that had started this movement to push back against the placement of sexually violent predators on the outskirts of town there. And so I asked her to come on to react to this veto from the governor. Sarah, welcome back to Undivided.
Good morning, Brandi. How are you?
I'm doing good, except for this story, which is really peeving me today. First of all, when you hear that the governor says that this would be too much of a burden on the state to let communities know about these placements, how does that strike you, ma'am?
It angers me. The word burden. How do you put a burden on Department of Social and Health Services? That's their job, is to make sure that we are all safe. So to burden them and the community is basically running amok with these SVPs out in our backyards. It angers me, absolutely.
Do you feel like some of what you guys have been fighting for is for naught?
We do. However, we're not going to give up. This just shows that the community has to watch for each other's backs, and that our governor does not care about public safety. He's more concerned about criminals' rights. He's more concerned about meeting the needs of the criminal, the sexually violent predators, more than the taxpayers themselves. And that's disheartening. And I got to be honest with you, Brandi, he is going to be leaving this state a mess. So I'm glad this is his last term, because we're in a big hole.
Yeah, and it's not just about not respecting or caring about public safety. You know, if you're in the school of thought, which I know some people are, that, hey, these guys have to go somewhere apparently, to just say that community members don't also have a right just to know, you know, just to be informed, just to not be cut out of the loop. So from what you guys went through in the fight you guys had, and, you know, you were successful in making sure that that facility did not open. And I do credit you guys in large part to raising such hell over it. What would your advice be for parents in other communities across the state about how, absent notification from the state, they can be aware of these things happening?
I think my advice is to stay strong as a community and don't give up. I mean, we're dealing with large agencies, we're dealing with the governor, we're dealing with the Attorney General's office, we're dealing with the court systems. And although criminals do have a right to go somewhere after they serve their sentence, we have a right to know if these sexually violent predators are our neighbors. And so my advice is to people is communicate with each other, talk with each other, and ask questions. Do your own research. Before you know it, it's like Enumclaw. They already have a sexually violent predator established in their backyards right next to a school bus stop. So you have to advocate for yourself, and you have to stay strong as a community, because this bipartisan bill that got vetoed, you know, everyone was trying to do their part, and the good old Inslee on his throne just poo-pooed it. And I have no idea why, because if he talks about safety concerns with Washingtonians, what a hypocrite. This makes zero sense to me. Yeah. So my advice to everybody is watch each other's backs.
Yeah. And finally, where are you guys taking your fight and your movement? Because you built this real coalition of parents that, you know, found their voice, wanted to speak up, wanted to keep their kids safe. So what is ahead for you guys?
We kind of partnered up with the folks in Enumclaw. You know, we attended their meeting a couple of months ago, and giving them facts and information and different avenues that they can go down. Go down and look at the Odyssey system down at the courthouse, pull those records of the individuals that's being released, see their conditions of the release, and be vigilant. Pass out flyers. We basically going back to the community. We talk to the people to Enumclaw. We give them tips and tricks, if you will, on what they should do. Talk to everybody in the police department, county commissioners. Everybody needs to be hands on decks with this. We can't change the law, but we can fight. We can still fight.
I love it. Well, Sarah, I'm glad you're still fighting. Sorry that the governor has, no regard for the people that he serves, but I'm glad you're still a voice on this. So thanks for joining us.
You're welcome, Brandi. Thanks again.
Yeah, and Sarah and the other parents who've been involved down there are just absolutely great. And I just feel for them. It's like, they couldn't get a bill through, a bipartisan bill that would have sought to not only halt the placement and removal of these sexually violent predators from McNeil Island and their placement in the communities, but it also would have required increased transparency for communities. There was bipartisan support for those proposals, but they didn't get across the finish line. And then you have a little bit of a longer period of time during the legislative session to sneak things in the budget. As long as they're tied to the budget. And so they were able to get this in. And for the governor to just veto it, why? I mean, honestly, he had to go out of his way to veto this, to say communities do not deserve to know or have a heads up if these people, the rape kids are going to be put in their backyard. Shame on him. And you know what? I know that Republicans in that statement, and Sarah, expressed their happiness that this is the governor's final full year or final term. But look, if Bob Ferguson wins, you think he's going to be any different? No. He's not going to represent some sort of substantial shift in the way that they value input from voters and value public safety. And so that's just as terrifying to me. And that's really what this comes down to is I think our expectations have become so low of government that we forget that they are supposed to be working directly for us. We pay them, we elect them. And so for Governor Inslee to take this active step to say, you don't get to know what's happening, something so serious, absolutely shameful, absolutely shameful.